Why is it that in 2019, Monster Reborn is allowed to be limited, but Premature Burial is still banned after a decade? On surface level analysis, Monster Reborn seems a lot better. It actually has 3 less restrictions than Premature Burial. It's not an equip spell, which means your opponent can't just get rid of it with Mystical Space Typhoon and get the monster off the field. It can select targets from either player's graveyard, which means you're not just restricted to your own graveyard, and Monster Reborn can summon the monster in either attack or defense position, where Premature Burial has to stick to attack position. Never mind the fact that there's even a 4th restriction that Premature Burial has to pay 800 life points. I'm not really factoring that into the analysis. It doesn't matter too much, but it's at least worth mentioning. In today's video, we're going to discuss the history of Premature Burial, what led it to getting banned in the first place, and also talk about how many of the restrictions placed upon the card are actually the reasons that it can't come back in 2019. Premature Burial is an equipped spell card that says as follows: activate this card by paying 800 life points and target 1 monster in your graveyard. Special summon that target in attack position and equip it with this card. When this card is destroyed, destroy the equipped monster. Now, maybe on paper you guys are wondering, well, what are the ways that you can actually abuse this card? Because after all, it does say when this card is destroyed, destroy the equipped monster. Well, in fact, one of the biggest issues with Premature Burial is a text that is not on this card and is found on cards like Call the Haunted that are very similar. If you read Call the Haunted, it seems very similar to Premature Burial, but there is one key difference, and the key difference that we're factoring in here is that Call the Haunted and many other cards like it all say when this card leaves the field, destroy the equipped monster, where in the case of Premature Burial, it just says when the card is destroyed. Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters because the main reason, the primary reason that Premature Burial is banned is because of its interactions with cards that bounce it back to the hand. Historically, non-hard once per turn effects have been abused by bouncing effects, but this may have started with Premature Burial, which is really interesting to look at. The main card that people were comboing with Premature Burial was Giant Trunade, a normal spell card that bounces all spells and traps back to the hand, and the reason that is such a deadly combo is because you could use 1 Premature Burial to summon 1 monster from your graveyard, and then use Giant Trunade to bounce that Premature Burial back to your hand and get a second summon. Of course, you're having to pay 1600 life points there, but back in the day that didn't really matter because, as we've discussed on the channel many times, life points usually don't factor in when we're talking about how good a card is, and that is especially true in the case of Premature Burial for old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Summoning 2 monsters off of 1 card is something you did not really see a lot back in the day, and even though it needed to combo with another card that was limited, Giant Trunade, it still was a deadly combination when pulled off. Not to mention the fact that if you could use this in combination with Dark Condition of Chaos, you could actually add back the Giant Trunade to your hand from your graveyard and then summon a 3rd monster if the Dark Condition was the 2nd monster that you summoned. That is an absolutely ridiculous interaction for old school Yu-Gi-Oh! And led to Premature Burial getting banned. To some people, the solution might be to then just ban Giant Trunade and let Premature Burial sort of run amok, but here's the thing. Premature Burial actually got banned before Giant Trunade, and at the time that it got banned, Giant Trunade wasn't a mainstay card in competitive play any longer. What's interesting is that when we look at the decks that were playing Premature Burial right up until the very end, you saw Premature Burial abusing a whole bunch of mechanics. In some cases, you were getting extra Elemental Hero Stratos searches or extra Disc Commander draws, but in a lot of cases, you were just using it to bring back big monsters like Dark Condition of Chaos, like Dark Lord Zerato. Premature Burial in many ways was just another copy of Monster Reborn for sort of those old school duelists. Obviously, people were bouncing it back with cards like Giant Trunade when their deck was playing Giant Trunade, but in a lot of cases, people were just using it as one more copy of a revival spell in an era of Yu-Gi-Oh! Where not every single deck had 50 Monster Reborn type cards like they do in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! It's worth mentioning then that perhaps Konami banned Premature Burial not so much because the card was way too overpowered for that particular format, that last format I've seen play, but maybe as an act of future-proofing, something that Konami rarely does. You see, right after Premature Burial got banned, Konami started to release many cards that could bounce things back to your hand. Things like DeLorean and Bryonic and even Zephyros were all cards that saw play in a variety of formats strictly because they could bounce back your own cards to your hand to continuously use them. Obviously, in the case of Bryonic, it could also bounce back your opponent's cards, but in general, people were using those cards in a lot of different combos to reuse and recycle their own cards, things like Premature Burial, if that card would have been legal. And I'm sure some of you watching this video so far that don't know as much about modern Yu-Gi-Oh as you do old school Yu-Gi-Oh are saying, well, this is a very simple fix. All you have to do to make Premature Burial able to become back as a limited card or even semi-limited card is change it so that, just like Call of the Haunted, it says when this card leaves the field, destroy the monster. And while I do see where that surface level analysis is coming from, because I've spent almost the entire video up until this point talking about that aspect of the card, there's actually a few more reasons this card, just because it's an equip spell, can't really come back. We actually saw something very similar happen when Konami brought back Snatch Steal for exactly one format in 2015. You see, the thing about Snatch Steal is that Konami in the past here is they've tried to bring back banned cards just at one copy to see how well they work out in the format. They did this with Regeki, they did this with Solemn Judgment, they did this with Monster Reborn, and in all of those cases the cards were perfectly fine at one copy per deck. Not every single deck was playing them. However, in the case of Snatch Steal, every single deck was playing it. It was way too good, and while Premature Burial might not be in the same boat, what's interesting about Snatch Steal and Premature Burial is that there's actually a card out there that kind of breaks them in some ways that they weren't intended to be broken. The card I'm referring to is Hidden Armory, a card that by sending the top card of your deck lets you search an equip spell from your deck or graveyard and add it to your hand, all at the cost of only giving up your normal summon for the turn. And Hidden Armory isn't even a once per turn effect, so if you have multiple copies, you can just cycle through all of them. It's probably the biggest reason that cards like Snatch Steal and Premature Burial can never really come back in any capacity to the Yu-Gi-Oh format, even though Snatch Steal was a card that not everyone used Hidden Armory with. I mean, it was most popular just as a one-of in a variety of decks. Some people did use Hidden Armory with that card, but I think in the case of Premature Burial, you'd actually see plenty of people using it in conjunction with Hidden Armory because it basically replaces your normal summon with a free special summon from the graveyard. Couple this with the fact that milling cards is very strong in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, and you have a situation where Premature Burial probably can't come back as long as Hidden Armory exists, not to mention all the bouncing effects from many of the cards we already mentioned. And I'm sure even after all of those points, even after explaining Hidden Armory, I will still get old school players or even new school players that say, well, what's the big deal about Premature Burial? There's tons of other broken stuff out there, and all we have to look at is Isolde and Living Fossil. Now, if you don't know what these cards do, that's totally fine. The important part of Isolde is that it sends differently named equip spells to the graveyard to summon warrior monsters from your deck. That is a very powerful effect and has seen play in plenty of competitive strategies, and the important part is that one of the equip spells that people are playing is Living Fossil, and Living Fossil is basically the most neutered down version of Premature Burial that you can possibly see, and yet it's still seeing play in those decks because of how good it is. So Living Fossil is an equip spell card very similar to Premature Burial, and it says activate this card by targeting one level 4 or lower monster in your graveyard. So already we have a new restriction. It has to be level 4 or lower. Special summon it and equip it with this card, but banish it when it leaves the field, even if this card has left the field. So you're seeing that restriction put on this card where even if you somehow manage to bounce back the Living Fossil or get rid of the Living Fossil, the card is still banished. And also you can see when this card leaves the field, banish the equipped monster. So not only does this get rid of the monster when Living Fossil leaves the field, it also immediately banishes it. The equipped monster loses 1,000 attack and defense, something we didn't see in Premature Burial, and also its effects are negated. You can only activate one Living Fossil per turn. So even with those restrictions on this card is still seeing play in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Even with the level restriction, even with banishing things, even though this banishes it when it leaves the field, it also negates the monster's effects and also reduces its attack and defense. This card is still seeing play with all of those things, and on top of being a hard once per turn, I think that is the easiest argument to make why Premature Burial can't come back. How can a card like Premature Burial ever come back if a card that is so much worse than it is still seeing play, just because the idea of an equip spell card that's generic that brings back monsters from the graveyard is a little bit too strong for Yu-Gi-Oh! In some ways, this is just another example of how older Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards not having hard once per turn restrictions makes them impossible to exist in modern metagames. We just saw this happen with cards like Armageddonite and Cannon Soldier being recycled and reused with Firewall Dragon, and it seems like in many cases cases when we see older cards come back to the forefront of competition, it's not so much because their effects are super high impact, but it's because whatever they do can be recycled with newer cards. It is worth mentioning that in the past, I've noted that cards like Pot of Greed aren't overpowered because you can recycle them, which obviously differs in cases like Premature Burial, and the big difference there is that Pot of Greed and things like it, things like Monster Reborn or Heavy Storm or Soul Charge if they came back, those cards, because they go to the graveyard immediately, are so much harder to recycle back to your hand that they're not even worth really considering in those discussions. When we look at a card like Premature Burial or cards like it, other equip spells like Snatch Steal, it's so much easier to recycle them because they just stay on the field when you use them compared to something that goes to the graveyard right away. I think it's worth mentioning this at the end of the video. I don't think it's super important when we're talking about these cards, but because I've mentioned time and time again that Pot of Greed isn't so good because it's being recycled by cards like Magician of Faith or Magical Stone Excavation, it's worth mentioning at least somewhere in this video that that's not the case with Premature Burial. It's a different sort of scenario. Anyway though, hope you guys enjoyed today's discussion video on Premature Burial and why it's banned. I'll see you later. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.